I am a life sciences executive who is now an impact innovator, focused on really deepening the impact from accelerating research and some of our tremendous life sciences innovations. I currently serve as an advisor at Red Sky Partners and am on faculty at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Healthcare Ventures. This topic that we are talking about today is very near and dear to my heart because it marries all of these agendas of innovation, life sciences, and healthcare disparities and health equity. And so we all know that clinical trials are a key part of cancer research. It enables the development of better drugs and treatments for cancer, a deadly disease. Finding the right set of patients to conduct comprehensive and effective clinical trials in oncology is critical to giving all patients an equal opportunity to live a healthy life. Unfortunately, there are many barriers to achieving diverse clinical trial participation, which have only been compounded by the recent pandemic, COVID-19. So today we have several experts that are going to help us really identify those barriers along with potential solutions so that we can really achieve meaningful scientific diversity in clinical trials. And so I would really like the audience to know that this is meant to be an interactive conversation, not only between the panelists, but also with all of you. There is a Q&A button located at the bottom of your Zoom webinar, as well as the chat function. Both of those will be monitored, so feel free to post whatever questions you would like to ask the panelists, and we will do our best to respond. And with that, I would first like to introduce Dr. Chris Lathan. Dr. Christopher Lathan is a medical oncologist at the Lowe Center for Thoracic Oncology at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and an assistant professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. In 2016, he became the medical director of Dana-Farber at St. Elizabeth's Medical Center in Brighton, Massachusetts. Dr. Lathan holds a master's degree in public health from the Harvard School of Public Health and a master's degree in science in cellular and molecular biology from UMass. He attended medical school at Tufts University of Medicine and completed his postdoc training in internal medicine, medical oncology, and cancer outcomes research at the Boston Medical Center and the Dana-Farber Harvard Cancer Center. Dr. Lathan's primary research interests are centered on the effects of race, class, and access to care on cancer outcomes, including racial disparities in lung cancer treatment, differences in somatic mutations across racial groups, perceptions of genetic testing by race and social class, population differences in targetable mutations in non-small cell lung cancer, and factors influencing willingness to participate in biobanking among Black men with and at risk for prostate cancer. He's a board member of the National African American Cancer Coalition and the Medical and Scientific Advisory Board for the Lung Cancer Alliance. He is a past board member of the Conquer Cancer Coalition and the Boston Healthcare for the Homeless. Dr. Lathan also serves on the Health Disparities, Cancer Education, and Scientific Review Committees for ASCO and the Minorities in Cancer Research Council for AACR. Dr. Lathan aims to bridge the gap between research efforts in disparities and the realities of patient care by developing interventions to increase access to a high level of quality care, developed in part through a high level of community engagement. He is the founding faculty director of the Cancer Care Equity Program at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and director of the Dana-Farber Community Cancer Care at Whittier Street Health Center in Roxbury, Mass., a pilot clinical outreach program that aids in the diagnosis and treatment of cancer patients at a federally qualified health center and integrates all three arms of clinical care: prevention, diagnosis, treatment, and survivorship. This effort also provides an opportunity to improve clinical trial accrual among vulnerable populations. And so with that, what an amazing bio, Dr. Lathan. Please enlighten us a bit more about the landscape that we've been talking about for recruiting clinical trials and also the need for more diversity in clinical trials. Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks, Alice. I'm sorry about that intro. I think it needs to have less words. But I think hopefully what I'd like to do today is hopefully set the table for discussion about clinical trials and barriers to clinical trials. As I just want to say first, thank you very much to the organizers and to AstraZeneca specifically for inviting me to give this talk along with our panel members, Dr. Fleury and also Dr. Opima. So if I could, and I hope to in about 10 to 12 minutes, give you some of my thoughts and a little bit of an overview of some of the work that many people have been doing in our communities for decades, but really over the last 6 or 7 months as we've had the spotlight shown upon structural racism in a more specific way. I wanted to give you an opportunity to hear what we were doing and think about what we're doing and really set the tone for discussion. So I think in any case, when we think and we talk a little bit about race, right? When we talk about race, we use this term a lot. I think, as we look at our politics, as we look at the structure of the United States, we really can't talk about anything without using race. And I think it's important to remind us all that race is a social construct. And I say this a lot and people always nod, but I think the truth is, we forget and sometimes we mix it up. And when we talk about clinical trials, you'll see what I'm getting to. So race we really are talking about is a proxy for ancestry, right? So what we're talking about with race is the phenotype, what we see and what we think, what we can guess someone's ancestry. But we know this is messy, right? We know that phenotype does not equal genotype. We learned that in biology. And what we really are talking about when we're talking about specifics for clinical trials and somatic mutations and all these other precision medicine things, we're really thinking sometimes about genetics, either genetics of the tumor or genetics of the patient. And ancestry gets you to genetics, and race is a poor and messy proxy for ancestry. And then, I think again, if you don't think about, many times people ask, how can we get vulnerable patient populations on clinical trials? Like there's a magic button you can press that can fix everything for this. And the truth is, if you don't talk about the impact of the institutional inequities and all of the ramifications, then it's hard to devise an intervention. You miss all the confounding variables. And we tend to sometimes in medicine want to look at biologic differences between the races, which the truth is, if you look at in cancer care outside of the hormone-specific cancers like breast and prostate, there's very little inherited differences in ancestry that are causing a lot of the problem. Most of the problem tends to be from these structural barriers. And sometimes it's more convenient to talk about biologic differences because we don't really want to really think about some of these bigger issues. And this, from in the Institute of Medicine's original report back in 2002, they had this framework, which I use, it looks dated, and I use it on purpose because there are a lot more pretty concept models out there, but I really still like the way that it was broken down. It's a way that it's easy to explain when you're talking to different communities and when we're talking to different groups about what we're talking about for disparities and inequity. And, I don't think we have to go too much into it, but you can see if you're looking at the differences between different groups, vulnerable groups, and break it down into clinical appropriateness, patient need preferences, right? That's okay if you're talking about this is what patients want. Then the other part, the disparity part, is really just, the operation of the healthcare system and the legal climate and the regulatory climate and discrimination and biases. And if you blow out the disparity part and you think about the biology, epidemiology, socioeconomic status, race and racism, and culture and ethnicity there, and I think those bottom three really account for 85% of what we're talking about. And if you ever get an opportunity to look at Dr. Kawaga Singer's her discussion of culture and cancer in 2010. It's a great way to look at this and think about how culture, even separate from race, really affects cancer care. In talking about the structural problem, and again, we're thinking specifically about how do we end up getting more diversity in our clinical trials? Well, first of all, take a look at how many of our physicians, and for a minute, I'm going to focus on Black patients and specifically. I think these issues are true for many different other groups of color, but I want to specifically talk about Black men and Black women in the US. And if you look at Boston, my city, and this is actually from a great piece that the Globe Spotlight team did a couple of years ago where they were looking at disparities. The one day they focused on health, they talked about this. If you can see, you're looking at the percentage of Black doctors in Boston hospitals. the percentage of US doctors who are Black is about 4.1%. And given that it's 13% of the population, we don't have to be good at arithmetic to see that that could cause some issues. And then when you look at the individual hospitals in Boston, where Carney Hospital is the winner at 6.4%, and the hospitals that I work at, right? So if you see, taking a look at the Dana-Farber down at 2.2% in oncology, the Brigham and Women's Hospital, 3.1%, you can see there's a major issue here. And it's not the only issue, matching patients and physicians by culture, race, that doesn't always work, but it's hard to really make inroads when you have so few, providers who look like their patients. And I think, as we, in this forum, we know that racial and class disparities are multifactorial. I don't have to convince you, although I will tell you, I spent the best part of, 2000 to 2010 still trying to convince people about the disparities. And if we don't really think about how we're going to disseminate all of our new treatments to our underserved patients, then the lack of access is going to be a problem, and clinical trials are the primary way to do that. And I think for us to focus a little bit on community-based efforts is really important, and I hope to spend the last couple of minutes talking a little bit about that. So we need policy changes as well as good science. I think sometimes we think that the good science alone will fix anything. I've heard that for a long time, Chris, rising tide lifts all boats. But the truth is, you got to start with the advocacy for those without voice, and then we have to really work with our individual communities. And I think the idea of transdisciplinary research, recently gave a talk at the Science of Health Disparities for ACR, and we talked a little bit about this. And I think we need to think about this as we approach clinical trials, because we tend to be very siloed as we think about how we can get folks on our clinical trials. You really need to think about, transdisciplinary research. Multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, these are good things, but we're talking about collaboration investigators who kind of are working a little bit outside of their own discipline to create their own intellectual space. Give me an example, Chris. So I think this is, many of us have seen, Roy Herbst's Nature paper, and he does a really great job of showing you the timeline of, lung cancer therapies and putting in somatic mutations as well as immunotherapies. And, I started my training somewhere around there. I don't like to tell my age, but now I spoiled it for everybody. And, really it was very different. How we were treating lung cancer was just chemo versus chemo. And we've made incredible inroads there. However, what we found, and in being lucky enough to be present where some of my colleagues were doing a lot of this work, I'm going to specifically talk about EGFR. In the early studies, this is what we were told. Look, this is a somatic mutation that's much more common in East Asian populations. White patients are in the middle, and Black patients are less than whites. At that time, nobody was even talking about South American populations. Nobody was talking about people who, where or any other places in Europe. It was really just, there's a couple polls here. We're talking about East Asian patients, white patients, and Black patients. And Black patients had the mutation less, is what we were saying early on. But of course, most of those studies were not matched for appropriate variables. We were taking this really binary approach to a non-binary variable. Race is not really binary, but we were really approaching it that way. And the truth was, and we were able to show this, that the mutational differences between white folks and Black folks in the US, there was no difference. And that was true when we looked at next-gen sequencing in general, because we were able to get more participation of diverse patients and that were really clearly annotated. And the truth is, in a somatic mutation, why aren't we thinking about region, zip code, granular socioeconomic status variables? I remember during this paper that we put out, I actually said, why aren't we looking at somatic mutations in lung cancer based on a socioeconomic status gradient? And the researchers, who are awesome people, were like, why would we do that? We're not going to see anything. And I said something smart like, well, that's why you do research, to ask the question. You don't know that you're not going to see anything. But the idea that it's hard to get people out of this track, that this, even though we know it's a somatic mutation, it makes sense to look at the environmental exposure for lung cancer. We're still stuck on race. And it's because we didn't have enough, social behavioral scientists, geneticists in this group to really push for this. And, just to kind of say, well, that's before Chris, we're much better now. Well, most of the people who are listening to this presentation know it's not true. And Ken Keel did some good work in JNCI that showed that even when you're looking at EGFR. More recently, in the SEER Medicare data, it still showed you that if you're poor, you're less likely to get sequencing for EGFR. We're not even talking about full next-gen sequencing panel. We're talking about EGFR testing. The testing rates were improved for everybody over time, but if you were poor, if you were Black, and you were not seen at an NCI cancer center, you were less likely to have the testing, which means you're less likely to get treated. And that's probably because, and if you look at the clinical trials, you were less likely to get on the clinical trials. And people would always say to me, my job is to cure cancer, right? It's somebody else's job to make sure the drugs get to the people. And sometimes that's true if you're talking about a lab-based researcher. And then we want to blame everybody. We all point fingers at each other. Oh, pharma needs to do it. The cancer centers need to do it. The insurers are the problem. But the truth is, it's a combination of all of us working together, right? That's really what needs to be done. And I wanted to just not leave us with, there's a whole bunch of problems, but we don't know how to fix it. This is really one of our, we're very lucky to have a small pilot program, the Cancer Care Equity Program. And it's where we are embedding ourselves in a federally qualified health center. And we were doing diagnostic screening, survivorship, and referrals. So we're not giving chemo there. And we did, it was built around a nurse navigator program, and we've had this for a while. And the truth is, we were lucky to have support, but it was built through philanthropy first. So it was one of those great ideas, get somebody else to pay for it situations. And when I presented this at NCI, they loved it. And they said the truth, which is, look, we're here to test hypotheses. We don't build infrastructure. And this is one of the things that we need to do. We need to actually build infrastructure into the community. And I think, luckily we've had some very, very forward-thinking donors. And I just want to get to some, the major points here. So, giving you an idea. So we saw about, now it's about 500 patients. The good news is there's not a lot of cancer in one specific federally qualified health center. But the key, and what I think is really interesting for us, was I was told that we're going to see benign heme all day, all night. And that's not what we found. We found there was some benign heme, about 25% was benign heme. We did a lot of screening, but there was about 20% of people who had cancer. And the reasons we saw people usually were follow-up for cancer, diagnosed sometimes in another country, some heme consults, folks who are getting some cancer treatment, a lot of genetic counseling and testing, cancer screenings, and then smoking cessation. What was interesting is that people who had a cancer diagnosis, when we looked at that subset, 24% of all the people with a cancer diagnosis had been on a clinical trial. And that's a combination of both therapeutic and non-therapeutic trials. And when you looked at the group that was on active treatment, it was a third. And this is a patient population that was 70% African-American, and 30% of those folks spoke Spanish. So a good mix of different groups all the way through. And so I think that, what we were looking at also is, our metrics, the time to resolution in days. And it's one small place to visit, it's small numbers, but we found that we decreased the time to diagnosis for people who had cancer. Before we got there, if you had an oncology problem, it took about 32 days for people to get to some sort of resolution or plan. And for us, for our oncology patients, it got down to 12.5 days. And even that program is not transdisciplinary enough. Why? It's a clinical program. It's got nurses, it's got PAs, I have genetic counselors. I work with the surgeons and dentists, but we don't have social behavioral scientists. We don't have bench researchers. And there's this fear of research in the community with this small cohort. We don't do biospecimens because we've been very, very respectful, but we really need to expand to other community partners and really go grassroots into the community. It's some of the community gatekeepers that have said to us, don't even talk about research. But the truth is, people will say yes to our cohort, and then when they come to the Dana-Farber, they're going on clinical trials. So we actually think that we can actually do a lot more, but we just have to get closer to the actual ground level community folks, and we have to expand our reach. I wanted to leave you with this idea about accountability. So that picture there is my mother. My mom and my dad were both from the segregated South. My dad never graduated from high school, and my mother graduated from high school and never went to college. And they, on both sides of my family, I'm a descendant of slaves in the U.S. My mother used to say this thing when she was, arguing with me and my brother and sister were arguing or misbehaving. She was angry with us. She would say, "I am tired of talking." It's a very common, Southern phrase. I'm tired of talking. And this is what I feel about where we are with what we're doing with cancer disparities in clinical trials. I've been talking about this for 20 years. I'm tired of talking. She passed from Alzheimer's, but her legacy stays with us. And she's a very religious person. She used to talk about faith without works is dead. And the idea is if you talk about things, if you see your brother or your sister suffering, and you say, gosh, that's awful, you keep walking, then it doesn't really mean very much. And I feel like that's where we've been in this. That being said, the last 6 months have really have us, really thinking about this in a different way. And for some people, this is a year of racial awakening. Many of us have been in this space for a long time, and we know that structural racism is not new, but now we can actually say structural racism, right? We used to just say built environment issues. We used to talk around it, and we didn't really talk about structural racism. God forbid, if you're a medical researcher, you want to talk about social justice. I can't tell you how many times in my career I was told I can't talk about social justice. You're a researcher, you're going to define disparities. But we can talk about these things now. And I think the words remain words, but we need actions. And I think there's a unique opportunity to bring things forward, and we need to hold ourselves and our institutions accountable. So I apologize if I went over, but hopefully this will allow for some opportunities for discussion. And that picture is my brother, my sister, and myself, just back when I was a little bit younger.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lathan, for that amazing talk. You are speaking my language as someone who is focused on impact innovation, both driving innovation towards the areas of greatest need, but also thinking about how do we optimize innovation coming from our research laboratories. This panel is titled Addressing Healthcare Disparities in Clinical Trials. I honestly think it should be addressing healthcare disparities through clinical trials. And what you had just said about needing to build the laboratory within which we can do this transdisciplinary research, I think the fact that we have representation from life sciences industry as well as from one of the largest philanthropic organizations focused on cancer and the advocacy affiliate is testament to now these forces beginning to converge. So thank you for that opening. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce the two other panelists who are with us today. And again, I feel so proud that this panel came together actually without my organization, which shows the desire for collaboration and thought partnership. I'll first start with Dr. Pandi Opima. Dr. Opima was born and raised in Uganda and is very passionate about finding ways to address health disparities within underserved populations. He has been advocating for clinical trial diversity since joining AstraZeneca in 2015. He holds a medical degree in stomatology, a master's in public health and epidemiology, and an MBA in global management, and has over 20 years of medical, public health, and pharmaceutical experience. And he hopes to use this experience to improve clinical trial diversity in his current assignment within the AstraZeneca Chief Medical Officers Organization and at AstraZeneca at large. Also joining him is Dr. Mark Fleury from the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network, ACS-CAN, where he is a policy principal. And I should also add that in addition to my life sciences innovation hat, I am actually a volunteer and a patient advocate. And so my own why, similar to Dr. Lathan's, is child of immigrants. My mother sadly passed away 11 years ago from undiagnosed colon cancer. She was not a native English speaker, but more importantly, she had a type of cancer that could have easily been diagnosed and treated with standard of care, but she was uninsured. And so the social, economic, and the systemic barriers to access are truly the drivers of outcome that we are not researching fully. And I hope that we can get to that conversation with Mark's participation and all of you. So Mark's, so I in that capacity am the chair of the American Cancer Society Eastern New England Area Board. That is a tremendous honor, and a member of the ACS-CAN National Board, which is just such a fabulous organization. So Mark specializes in research, drug development, and regulatory policies, along with other science and technology related projects. He has worked extensively on the reform of diagnostic testing oversight and helped lead a coalition in 2016 that authored a landscape report on drug development challenges in pediatric cancer, and led another coalition in 2017 that created a report and recommendations focused on overcoming cancer clinical trial enrollment barriers. He currently sits on the steering committee of Targeted Agent and Profile and Utilization Registry, the TAPER study, which examines the use of targeted anti-cancer agents used in off-label clinical settings. Throughout his work, Mark has striven to incorporate patient perspectives into inherently science-based issues, advocating for the inclusion of patients as partners through the bench to the bedside translation of science. In addition to his ACS CAN experience, Mark's policy work includes time as a Capitol Hill legislative advisor, focusing on healthcare reform, and work at AACR, the American Association for Cancer Research. He holds a PhD in bioengineering from the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne in Switzerland and conducted postdoc research at MIT. His former research includes investigating the mechanisms of tumor metastasis and signaling pathways responsible for the activation of immune cells. So again, we have a tremendous panel with us today, and we again encourage our audience to ask questions in the chat. But let me start first with Dr. Opima to just, from your perspective at AstraZeneca and with your global viewpoint, tell us about how important the problem is from your standpoint. Do you think clinical trial diversity should be a priority? And if so, why? And you are on mute, so let's take you off mute.
Oh, thank you so much, Alice, for the great introduction. And thank you, Dr. Lathan, for such a tremendous presentation. I think following you, I don't know how I can match into your shoes. And hopefully, Mark, you will support me in this. I think this issue is really a big problem. And as Dr. Lathan alluded to, is that we think of medicines within the industry. Who is a recipient of medicines? It's the patient. And during the process of our drug development, we think in terms of who are we going to give the medicines? Unfortunately, when you look at the epidemiology of the diseases, they are not really reflected within our clinical trial setup. And then we hope that we are going to give these medicines to everybody. Given the fact that we don't know how these patients really react to these medicines or what sort of adverse events, reactions to the drug, how receptive are they to these drugs, the efficacy, all that we don't know. We tend to find out later in the drug development process when the drug is already on the market and we try to retroactively start looking at this. So I think it's really important that we think in terms of who is affected. It doesn't even necessarily mean it has to be a racial question, but it has to be what part of, for example, the country is mostly affected, and even finding out maybe there are environmental reasons why these people are diseased and whether there are implications when they are taking the medicines. So we always have to think in terms of how do we get diversity of patients within clinical trials that reflects what the disease in question is actually. And unless we do that, it's always going to be a big problem. And I think that's why it's a priority. And to me, I think it's one of the biggest things you can do if you want to address health disparities.
Thank you. Thank you for that perspective. And so that's a great segue into Mark. ACS CAN is the advocacy affiliate of the American Cancer Society, which has an active disparities research agenda and is also one of the largest non-governmental funders of cancer research in the world. This is a tough time for ACS and for all nonprofits. We know the importance of philanthropic funding, so I'll put that plug out there for those who are interested in sustaining the progress that we've made in the fight against cancer. But in particular, ACS CAN has looked specifically at these barriers to patient participation in clinical trials. And you worked with a broad set of stakeholders to author that white paper, and that's also translated into some policy, activation. So tell us a little bit more. What did you guys learn in your research, outcomes and policy research, about the barriers generally, as well as more specifically for certain underserved populations.
Sure. Thanks, Alice. And let me start off by, again, thanking the sponsors for inviting me here, and really feel honored to be on the same stage here with Dr. Opima and Dr. Lathan. So yeah, we really spent close to a year taking a deep dive into literature, and we looked at barriers patients face, patients in general face in getting on cancer clinical trials, because, we have this unusual situation where cancer patients in general have a high interest and willingness to enroll in clinical trials. And we know that many clinical trials are struggling to meet their accrual goals, and some, maybe as many as 1 in 5, actually fail because of low accrual. So what's responsible for this conundrum where willing patients can't get on the trials that need and want them? Well, one of my pet peeves as a patient advocate is that sort of the language that was often used about this seemed to point the finger so much at patients, like, why aren't these patients getting on clinical trials? We took a look at the barriers and we divided them into sort of different buckets: structural barriers, for which the patient really has no control over, and then looking at those that the patients do have control over. And it turns out that structural barriers are far and away the biggest reason why people can't get on clinical trials. There's not a clinical trial open at the site where they're seen. If there is one open, oftentimes the eligibility criteria keep them off. When you get down to the point of, maybe fewer than 1 in 4 patients could even enroll in a clinical trial if they wanted to. So right there, 3/4 of the population with cancer is already sort of structurally excluded from participating. We more recently just published a paper last month that looked at acceptance rates. So we asked the question, if you are a patient and you are offered a clinical trial, what percentage will say yes? And the answer is about 55% on average will say yes. So more people will say yes than will say no. So it tells us there's a high willingness. Now, the question here is, that's overall for a general population. And by the way, that research we just published last month, we looked at the difference in acceptance rate between Blacks, whites, and Asians. And, there was statistically absolutely no difference between acceptance rates. So I think it's important there. We often assume that certain, not only do cancer patients in general not enroll because they're saying no, but subpopulations are saying no because, they're skeptical of research. At least our research doesn't bear that out. So I think it really points to the need to, if you want more people on a clinical trial, you have to ask them. You have to make the trials available to them, put them at sites, where they're actually being seen, and invite them, and they'll say yes. But to the question of disparities, why some groups are less represented than others, again, all of these structural barriers are also felt by underrepresented minorities, but in some cases they're felt to an even greater degree than the population in general. So I really like something that Dr. Lathan had said. He said there's no magic button. And I think we really found that there are multiple barriers. And if you're hung up on any one of those hurdles, you don't make it to the end. So it's not enough to focus on one and say, hey, look at the progress we made in X, making trials available or something like that. You have to make sure that the hurdles are lowered all throughout the process. So no easy fix, and we really have to do a lot of ground level blocking and tackling to address those barriers as they come up.
It's fascinating, Mark. Thank you for sharing that. And it does ring true to something, Dr. Lathan, you had mentioned earlier, even in just the level of diversity and representation among the provider population, and then some of those other institutional barriers. So can you validate, what you just heard from Dr. Opima and Dr. Fleury in terms of your specific efforts, and were there solutions that stood out, as ones that were particularly promising?
Yeah, I just want to say for both for Mark and Pandy, I obviously this resonates with me. I think, on one level, right, what we found is there's no substitute for being present in the community to get their trust, right? So in the end, right, as you heard Mark discuss this, right, one is, you just have to offer clinical trials to the community that you want in a way that they can access it. And on one level, that sounds pretty straightforward, right? Why don't we just do that? And I think, so one of the things that we were able to do is be present. And by being present, I'm being very specific. We went there and we stayed and we built this clinical program. It wasn't on a grant cycle. It didn't have to do with a specific, oh, right now we have this incredible work coming out of our phase 1 group. We want to do some liver work and now we need to, recruit these folks. That is harder to do because that's when you get into your trust issues, right? That's when the ghosts of these other things like Tuskegee and all these other things come up because you're coming to the community for an ask and they don't know who you are, where you been. And so I think one of the things that we have found is just being present. The other is kind of getting people acclimated to this process. So when people come in to see us, it was just a cohort study. But I would talk to them and then I would say, okay, now my colleague's going to come in and talk to you about, do we have your permission to use your information to talk about the quality of our work? And this is my hypothesis. I don't have any data on this, but I feel that just that pre-priming, having the discussion, being present, how I asked the question, some great work that came out of Carmonas, right, with Terry Albright's group, where they said how you talk about this and how you ask the questions, how comfortable you are, that makes a huge difference. So I think that's where we had some advantages there. And also, we weren't doing direct cancer treatment. So we could say, let's have these conversations, let's do all these things, and then we would navigate them to the cancer center, but they were already comfortable and there was already trust. So when they brought it up, I think that's one of the reasons that people were able to move forward. So it's what Mark said, multiple levels, multiple things happening at the same time.
Perfect, thank you. And I know that while you had just mentioned it wasn't about the cancer treatment itself, I think Dr. Opima, you are in the business of developing solutions, medicines for patients. And, some of that work takes place at AstraZeneca's very large research presence in Waltham, Massachusetts, one of the largest early clinical and discovery small molecule research centers for AstraZeneca. Can you talk a little bit about, from the drug developer standpoint, what are your plans to really address clinical trial diversity and how are you contributing to the overall solution? And you're on mute.
I think I'm going to leave my button on moving forward. Yeah, as I had mentioned, when I started at AstraZeneca in 2015, I came in and I saw the company is really diverse in terms of racial kind of spread, and I thought this was a fantastic place to start working at. And so I thought by bringing together people that were like me and trying to sort of promote the cultural sensitivity within the company would help us at least understand from the point of what do we really go through. And so I formed this group, and it started as sort of like an entertainment play sort of group. And eventually we thought deeper into it and we thought, well, we are within an industry, we have neighborhoods and communities that actually need to be served. And we haven't really played a big role in sort of improving their understanding of the industry. And so we started discussions. We invited people from Johns Hopkins and the University of Maryland and NIC, and we talked about what would be done to improve clinical trial participation. And as we were talking about it, we had invited our chief medical officer, and she kind of listened in, and then she really grew a lot of interest. She had talked about it, and that's why we thought maybe this would be our good person to work with. And she straight away went to the head of research and development and said, I want this on our scorecard. I want it to be a problem that needs to be resolved, because I think for long we have seen literature shows that about 3 to 5% of Black people are represented in clinical trials. And if you give an example of prostate cancer, for example, we know Black men are affected more than white men. But recently there was a publication in AACR, I believe, that looked at trials ranging from 2006, I think, to 2016, and they found that on average, 3% of Black men were represented in those clinical trials. Mind you, the ratio of Black to white in terms of prostate cancer is almost 2 to 1. And so you ask yourself a question, why, right? It should be the reverse. And so we started thinking, and so we said, you know what, we need to form a group or an initiative that needs to address this question within the company, so that we can start addressing each and every clinical trial that starts to address the question of diversity. And so we have started an initiative, and it's really based on the 3 strategic pillars. One of the first strategic pillar is using data. We have to define the problem, right? And so we have to look at the data within the company and see how we've been performing, so that we can set up a benchmark to start sort of gauging ourselves whether we are really on the right track or not. The other one was to look at barriers, as Dr. Flory had mentioned. There are those what we refer to as internal barriers, which are barriers that are actually created by us. For example, the way we write protocols, not so flexible. They exclude a lot of potential patients. And so by the time you find the patients who we're supposed to actually be looking at have comorbidities that are excluded from sort of unintentional biases brought into the protocols. So we said, let's look at these barriers. Let's look at the barriers, external barriers that involve what the patients really go through in order to participate in a trial. There are patients who have to live on a clock in, clock out type of jobs, and if they clock in, if they don't clock in, then they don't have a paycheck. And so you're telling me that they have to think in terms of, do I go to work or do I go for a clinical trial, when there's a standard of care that they could easily have? So those are some of the barriers we are trying to identify, and how do we tackle them? So the third barrier then becomes solution development. How do we tackle this? The reason I'm sort of bringing up this is because I don't want it to be a band-aid type of resolution of the need. I want it to be a long-term sustainable solution, that when we start thinking in terms of writing a protocol, the first thing we have to look at is the epidemiology. And then within the protocol, you actually write that you want to focus on specific populations or specific social demographics or whatever it is that actually has caused this disparity in the. So this is what we are doing. And then we'll embed all these activities within our own platforms that we use, for example, for site feasibility, for identifying physicians. We also have these pilot projects. Like we have one, I call it the Baltimore project, which is pretty much kind of reflects what Dr. Lathan had talked about. And then we have talked about also kind of collaborating with you within the Boston area. So there are plans in place. And then we are also trying to work with alliances within the industry, like pharma, Transcelerate, Code, and Cscript, just so that we have sort of like harmonized ways of doing things within the industry itself.
It's great. Thank you so much. And it's just really remarkable how you are thinking proactively about internal barriers, but also working collaboratively externally. And with that, I want to have time to turn to the audience questions. But before that, just ask Mark, because this month, in fact, just this week, we saw the FDA release guidance on enhancing the diversity of clinical trial populations, eligibility criteria, enrollment practices, and trial designs guidance for industry. A lot of companies are hesitant to go out on a limb. They think that this is risky. There may not be enough data out there to really, reconcile some of the differences that they're seeing in outcomes from the clinical trials. But talk to us a little bit more about, policy making and policy, both in terms of enabling the solutions that we heard about, but also paving way, for companies to do the right thing or organizations to do the right thing.
Sure, thanks. And I know folks were having a little hard time hearing me before. Can you hear me okay? Okay, yes. Great. So, as I mentioned, there are a multitude of barriers. And so when we think about a policy approach to solving those, again, it's no magic button. Like Dr. Lathan said, we have to do it in multiple ways. Some of the ways that we have been pursuing that is, you mentioned the FDA guidance, which was not necessarily cancer specific, that just came out. We commented on that when it was a draft guidance. So weighing in with those types of regulatory or guidance decision. There have been a series of guidances that have come out over the last few years, driven by some work that ASCO and Friends of Cancer Research have done to look at sort of what are the default eligibility criteria that most clinical trials use. Many of them have been inherited, just copy paste over the years. And as a good example, many clinical trials exclude those with an HIV infection and maybe in 1985, that was a valid exclusion, but today folks with an HIV infection have a normal lifespan and there's no reason necessarily to keep them off clinical trial, but those eligibility criteria have been cut and pasted for 30 years. So there's been a series of guidances that really take a look at some of those eligibility criteria and ask the question, are they scientifically valid? And I think, the second question is, are they keeping people off of the clinical trial in a discriminatory way? And I think Dr. Opima mentioned this, do you design your clinical trials? So we've certainly weighed in a lot on those FDA guidance documents. We've also looked at issues around policies of supporting patients' non-medical costs. There is sort of a narrow window where sponsors can do that. A lot of sponsors are nervous. So I think that's important that we create clear, safe harbors so that there is comfort from sponsors that they can help pay for travel and parking and food and things like that. Because again, those affect financially, folks from lower SES much more than others. Things that COVID has done is really highlighted the way that we can operate clinical trials that don't require folks necessarily to come into the clinic. So I think we've had a really steep learning curve here. And one of the things that we're looking at is how can we, take these flexibilities that have been granted during COVID and keep them alive and going afterwards. So as Dr. Opima mentioned, somebody who's really making a decision, do I take off work to go or not? Spend half a day on, taking 3 buses to get across town. If they could do that visit in, 30 minutes at their house before they, took off for work, that certainly opens up some opportunities. We've also sponsored legislation that asks the federal government to do sort of a front to back scan of their policies that may either sort of intentionally or unintentionally create disparities in clinical trial enrollment. And then sort of the last thing I want to highlight that ACS CAN is doing is going back to this idea that we need to democratize the opportunity to enroll in a clinical trial. If you ask folks, you'd be surprised at how many will say yes. But right now, clinical trial operation tends to be something that is primarily done at academic medical centers. And so what we're trying to do is create sort of no-cost infrastructure that would allow high-level screening to occur no matter where you're being seen for cancer, and you may find out that there is an excellent clinical trial, 5 miles away from you. Right now, there's no way of really knowing that unless you're a really activated patient who's going through a lot of work on your own to find that. So what we're trying to do is lower that activation energy. So we have a really broad basket of activities that we're trying to pursue. But as I mentioned, I think there's no one silver bullet here.
That's great, Mark. Thank you. And it resonates with what Dr. Lathan opened around capacity and capability uplift, and that clinical trials may actually help some of those institutions and providers who currently don't have access to the cutting edge, enhance their ability to increase testing, to have additional resources to support patient engagement and education. So all of that layers on top of each other. We have several questions from the audience about COVID, and Mark, you highlighted one of the few silver linings from COVID, which is alternative site of care and, using technology. But COVID has also highlighted that we have these very deep healthcare disparities that existed well before the pandemic. And so with that, combined with a heightened awareness around systemic racism, we have, we think, a window, an opportunity to really create change. At the same time, COVID is scary for patients having to come in for clinical trials. And on the American Cancer Society, we know that screenings and testing has dropped, numbers are ranging from 95%, maybe 65%, with a little bit of a bump. But maybe I can ask Dr. Lathan to just comment, what is the state of the state when it comes to COVID and what we're trying to do on all those different levels, get research back up and running, still fulfill this aspiration of promoting more diverse clinical trial populations, while also understanding that these populations are hurting now more than ever.
Yeah, you gave me an easy question there, Alice. I think, I think, so in my clinical practice, we've been talking about this quite a bit, and to piggyback on what Mark was saying, there's the telehealth aspect of this is a double-edged sword. So we've been able to utilize some aspects of this to do verbal consents, which is a big deal. One of the things that, we've always had to bring people in because we were told that's the way it has to be. And then when COVID came, we found actually we can innovate around and figure out different ways. And for some populations, I think that is helpful, to know that you don't have to, like you said, you don't have to take the bus, the train and get there. On the other hand, there are not a lot, folks also have trouble. This is difficult. We don't have navigators that help us with this. Not everybody has, access to Wi-Fi. Even when you have a phone, and most people will have a phone in the US, how you use your phone on Zoom is totally different. And, whether this is an age issue, a language issue, or a culture issue, people struggle with this. And we don't really have a lot of money to do the infrastructure and the navigation that we should. So we basically built the process. And we always, and this is true in cancer and everywhere, we build it for the highest, the people who have the highest means first. We say, okay, we're going to put this in here and people are going to come to it. Then we try to back calculate how we make it work for other folks. So I think those are the areas that we struggled. In your screening discussion, obviously, as a lung cancer doctor, I have seen, everything shut down on the screening side. And then when we were able to convince people to come back, there were two sets of people. There were the people who, delayed follow-up scans because they were told to stay home. I had a conversation in clinic with a woman just the other day who unfortunately has advanced stage disease. And there were some scans that were supposed to happen in February. And she said, well, I was told to stay home because it was scary. So I did the right thing, I thought. And so we had to have this whole conversation about this. And I think there's some people that COVID, all of our screening has dropped down. And then for our most vulnerable patient populations, they're most affected by COVID, and then are also scared to come in. So we have the people who need it the most, they're the most frightened. And then the last part about this is our clinical trials infrastructure, even at the big NCI cancer centers, when we stopped everything except for the people who are on trials, and we didn't expand any new trials. And there were things, people got co-opted. A lot of CRCs are doing screening, and suddenly we're now fighting to get this whole infrastructure moving again, and it's hard. That being said, COVID is really, I think we've kind of, now that we recognize that, we're trying to push everything back and make it a little more resilient. So it has been a struggle, and patients are definitely being affected both on the screening side and also on trying to get everything moving again as well. I also want to take just a quick moment. I know that there was a question about incarceration I saw in clinical trials. I just want to say this, one of the things, besides the fact that people of color are being incarcerated at very, very high rates in the United States, the issues there is it's a special group, and some of these rules are we putting in there to protect people make it very difficult to do clinical trials in that space. Not impossible, but very, very difficult. So that's one of the reasons that folks who are incarcerated, you haven't seen clinical trials, and actually getting basic care there is even very difficult. So I think if we were thinking about how to, expand our clinical trials to folks who are incarcerated, there's a waiver you can do with some of your consent, because anybody goes on a clinical trial, sometimes there's a little thing that says, look, if the government really needs to come and you're accused of a crime, or we have to release that information. And so there's a waiver that NCI allows you to say this information is protected unless there's a real emergency, and that allowed us to buy some cred in our community. But that's kind of the next level of conversation about how do we think about pregnant women, and how do we think about folks who are actually incarcerated in these other protected communities where we can still keep the protections, but also think about innovative ways to make access for them as well.
Absolutely. And there's other questions in the chat which reflect some of these underserved populations that we haven't called out, the elderly, the rural populations, people of different sexual orientation. And so I would highly encourage many of the audience members who are asking questions about where they can get more information, where they can learn more about some of these structural barriers, to follow up with the publications that Dr. Lathan and Dr. Fleury mentioned, because there's a wealth of information in terms of patients educating themselves. There was also a quick question in the chat about American Cancer Society's funding towards health equity research. Again, that's a growing area, and it is one that we are so committed to. The challenge, of course, is our ability to fundraise during these very tough times. And so these are the types of research programs that are most at risk. And we are hurting for them, but we are committed to try to reignite research wherever possible. So we need to sadly close, because we could go on for hours and hours, I think, with all of the wealth of information that's been shared today and the diversity of perspectives. And so I'd like to close by really asking our panelists to, kind of looking to the future. If you could just pick one thing, again, with the goal of addressing either healthcare disparities within the clinical trials themselves, or really mobilizing and enabling clinical trials to address broader healthcare disparities, what would be the one thing that you would like to see either started, stopped, or scaled moving forward? So why don't I start with Dr. Opima?
I think one thing I would want to see is the way we conduct clinical trials. I want them to reflect the characteristics of the diseased population. If we can achieve that, I think we will have addressed a lot of the disparities that we see within the health disparity.
Thank you. And Dr. Fleury?
Yeah, I think what I would really recommend is I think that this has to happen at the ground level for folks who are designing clinical trials and running them. So I think anyone who's responsible for developing a clinical trial, they need to take a patient-centric design approach. I mean, I think our researchers so often, go directly to their scientific question, which is understandable, and develop the trial around that. But I think we really need to understand at the base of this, clinical trial is a patient, and invite a patient to help you design it. You really need to do your own sort of barrier analysis at your own site and for your own trial, because it may vary trial to trial, but I think it's really taking that design approach from the get-go.
Great. And Dr. Lathan?
Yeah, I think following up a little bit on what Mark said, I think meeting up on the NCI cancer centers a little, I think they need to engage not just when they need something or when they want something. It has to be a prolonged engagement with communities so that we can do what Mark just mentioned. So there are relationships that allow you to say, hey, let's talk about how we're going to put this trial together. And if they really mean what they say, they're going to have to put money where their mouth is.
Perfect. Perfect. So again, the beginning of an ongoing conversation, but what I heard there is collaboration, it is diversity of perspectives at all levels, including decision-making and infrastructure building. What I also heard there is being very intentional, and not being a sort of opportunistic, that this is an agenda that has to stand on its own. And so from this panel, I think we've all heard of not only the importance of diversity in clinical trials to ensure that the medicines that are developed, if they are clinical trials for drug approvals, can serve the broadest population possible, because then we have the data needed to be able to ensure that patients are achieving the outcomes that we intend. And also the clinical trials to really heal our healthcare system, and what we need to do to transcend some of the barriers and silos in which our research currently takes place, so that we can achieve the system level transformation that is needed, not only to advance therapeutics and diagnosis, but also to ensure that the outcomes are equitable across patients. And so how we get there, more diagnostics around the barrier, so more conversations around what specifically is standing in the way. Cultural shift is what I also heard in terms of patients, providers, the systems, the payers, the companies themselves, and that sounds like it's happening from within, but maybe policy can help drive and align some of those incentives. And again, how can we pave the path for new collaborative research transdisciplinary models? So with that, I thank our esteemed panelists for a really dynamic discussion. I hope we have the opportunity to continue this again in the future and report on progress. And I thank all of the audience for your attention and your continued partnership and engagement. Have a great rest of day.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Sure.
Thank you, everyone.